Kia ora koutou. First of all, thanks to John and Consumer New Zealand for hosting us here today. And secondly, thanks to media as well for coming for this announcement. Today, and without further ado, I can announce that we're appointing a permanent grocery commissioner, and they will be hosted at the Commerce Commission, and they will maintain a watchful eye over the supermarkets. The permanent commissioner will be a referee for the sector, keeping the duopoly honest and proactively blowing the whistle where a problem is suspected. The grocery commissioner will also ensure government's reforms for the sector are implemented and that Kiwis are getting a fair deal at the checkout. The grocery commissioner will be solely focused on supermarkets, supported in their efforts with a base at the Commerce Commission. It makes sense to do it this way. The Commission has a wealth of knowledge when it comes to economic and competition regulation. They've got sleeves rolled up experience with economic and competition regulation, fair trading, consumer protection, and of course with the grocery sector itself. And we want our watchdog to be able to tap into that resource whenever it is required. The Grocery Industry Competition Bill is expected to be introduced later this year, and a commissioner will be appointed following the bill's passing. We need to ensure we get the right person in the role so that the search will, of course, be thorough. This appointment ultimately is too important not to get right on behalf of consumers. Further to that, today I can announce that consultation opens on a mandatory code of conduct for the sector. That'll be a code of conduct between major grocery retailers and their suppliers. Historically, there has been an imbalance in the bargaining power major grocery retailers have over their suppliers. The Grocery Code of Conduct will address this by preventing the major retailers from using their power to push costs and risks onto those suppliers. It will ensure that this relationship is conducted fairly. That's especially important for the small artisan brands that are emerging, startups that want to get their products on shelves. We want them to feel empowered, and we also want consumers to enjoy the extra range, the added variety that smaller producers bring to our supermarkets. The draft Code of Conduct has been developed with input from an advisory group that includes representatives from the major grocery retailers and from groups that represent suppliers and also consumers. This draft code is available on MBIE's website and will be open for feedback for 5 weeks. The other actions and reforms as part of the government's response to the grocery retail market study are also moving at pace. Last week, our bill to ban restrictive covenants passed into law. That means we have officially put an end to the anti-competitive land wars, which have been silently hampering competition in the grocery sector for years. It will stop the major supermarkets from dictating the terms of leases to block opposition retailers from getting a foothold in an area, and should come as great news to would-be competitors who will now be able to access suitable land for their new stores without having to worry that they're going to have to fight legal battles ahead. Momentum is with us now, and government will continue to keep supermarkets in the spotlight to ensure that Kiwis get a fairer deal at the checkout. I invite John from Consumer New Zealand to come forward as well. He may be, I suspect, happy to take questions from a consumer perspective. Obviously, Consumer New Zealand has been a part of putting the Code of Conduct together. So John and I are now very happy to take questions.
Minister, what powers will the Grocery Commissioner have?
So the Grocery Commissioner will have the ability to issue warnings. They'll have the ability to put fines in place as well for when Code of Conduct breaches have been established. That may well be yet a percentage of turnover, which would certainly keep larger players focused, I think. And they'll be able to go to the courts as well and seek that contracts be overruled. There are a range of other kind of trade remedies that are available to them, but they'll have quite substantial powers.
And so how will you guarantee that and then on the cost, Code of Conduct, how will you guarantee that the cost of compliance won't be passed on to consumers?
Well, the reality is that currently by the Commerce Commission's most conservative estimate, it's $1 million a day in excess profits that the supermarkets are taking. So we think, that if there is a cost incurred, it'll be trivial compared to the amount that can potentially be saved in the sector on behalf of consumers.
But how will you guarantee that even if it is a trivial cost, people can't afford food at the moment, even if there is a trivial cost, how will you ensure that that isn't passed on?
Well, we think if we can address the problem of hundreds of millions of dollars a year going out in excess profits, that will make things better for consumers overall.
And when will consumers actually see the effects of what you've announced today?
Well, of course, we are starting to see effects from the overall package of changes. The market study itself has had an impact. We've seen the grocery retailers, for the first time ever, say that they think having a regulator is a good idea. We've seen them say, actually, they want a mandatory code of conduct. We've seen them say, we'll remove land restrictive covenants off land and leases for the first time ever, and they're actually going about doing it. They've also put price freezes in place. So we're seeing a whole lot of action now that we haven't seen before. What we're interested in, though, is making sure that's long-term and structural, so that consumers can be sure they're getting a fair deal at the checkout longer term.
And you said that's going to take the pressure off immediately. How immediately are we talking, and how much money are we talking? Are you saying that consumers can expect a lower grocery bill as a result of these changes?
We will see the legislation come into the Parliament this year. When that legislation is passed, we'll go on a thorough search for the Commissioner. That search will then ensure that we have a Commissioner in place in the first half of next year. We're seeing, as I say, we are seeing changes in behaviour of the supermarkets, and the Commerce Commissioner are already acting as an interim regulator, so don't lose sight of that, because we have asked them to be proactive in their monitoring of the covenants and leases, and to be proactive in general now to make sure that competition is working in the sector. And as a result of their market study, they have said they're going to investigate some areas where they've already got concerns.
So there might not be a commissioner until about this time next year. How is that acting quickly to take pressure off the sector?
Oh, look, I would expect a commission to be in place earlier than that, but actually the legislation's got to go through the House. And already we are seeing the change in terms of the behaviour from the sector, the way in which the grocery sector has welcomed a code of conduct, is participating actively, and has participated in its development, has welcomed a commissioner as a response, is putting price freezes in place. We expect to see ongoing good behaviour from the sector while the spotlight's on it, and this will ensure that longer term we have one person who is responsible for overseeing the whole sector. And we've seen that work with the Telecommunications Commissioner, where there's an identified person that both the sector knows it has to answer to, but also consumers know they can go to for help.
Yeah, and at the beginning, in your opening statements, you said the Commissioner will keep them honest. Are you saying that they're not honest now?
Well, I'm saying what I said. The Commissioner will keep them honest.
So are you saying that they're not honest now?
I'm saying the Commissioner will keep them honest.
We could go back and forth for a long time. Are you just not willing to say that they're not honest at the moment?
Oh, look, I think what we've seen in the past is that there have been concerns. Suppliers have been unwilling to come forward publicly and state their concerns for fear of repercussions. The environment has not been conducive to fair practice, and we are expecting that it will be from now and into the future.
Just following that question, is the warnings, fines, is it the day-to-day job of the Commissioner? In terms of the annual state of competition, will that lead to legislative change in the House? What's the point of that compared to the fines and warnings?
So the annual State of Competition report, the intention behind that is to maintain a spotlight on the sector. We know that in the UK, for example, where they have regular reporting of competition in the sector, suppliers and others know that if they come forward, there will be action. They can rely on a fair referee, an independent adjudicator, to come and look at that conduct, examine it, and take action if need be, and that in a year's time there'll be another refreshed look. Where the Commerce Commission recommended a 3-year time frame, we thought that was too long, and the consequences for suppliers in the meantime, if they were frozen out of the sector, could be too great. And so that's why we want a rolling review of the sector to keep the spotlight on it all the time.
And I'm just having a look at the draft code of conduct. At the moment, are you looking, what's your, because there's quite a few options on some of the way that supermarkets can be designated to be underneath this code of conduct. There's option A, B and C. what's your preference, and are you wanting to have voluntary or involuntary code of conduct?
Oh, look, I'm wanting the code of conduct to be signed up to by everyone and adhered to. I want it to be mandatory. Now, how that plays out, I mean, this is what the 5 weeks of consultation are for. It's been developed with a broad spectrum of interests, with consumer groups represented, and I'll invite John to say a little bit in a minute about that, with suppliers, and also obviously with the duopoly represented around the table. So it's something that everybody's expecting to sign up to. This 5 weeks of consultation now gives any other interests a chance to have a say. We want the best system there is. There's attraction in looking at the UK system where it's principles based, and people can see that those principles get followed up on. The Australian model, I'm told, is a little more prescriptive, and we share a lot in common with them as a market. So there's merit in looking at their model, and then of course there's a merit in trying to pick the best out of both. So the consultation is broad, no apology for that, but it does give guidance as to what the range of options are that are being considered, and I'm very much looking forward to the feedback on that. John, would you like to say a little bit about the consumer experience on that panel, perhaps?
Well, look, it's been a very interesting experience, and I think MB officials have done really well in balancing the interests of suppliers, consumer representatives and the industry. The consultation documentation is broad, but that's good. It creates the space for people to input their ideas, and hopefully we'll see a good result out of it.
Yeah, great.
Just one more question for you,
Yeah.
Minister.
Yeah, sure.
The Commerce Commission's been criticised in the past for failing to pull supermarkets into line. Given that the watchdog will be based at the Commission, how can people have confidence in the watchdog?
Well, we will have one commissioner who is solely responsible, and that's a model we've seen working elsewhere. I guess the attraction with the Commission is, firstly, it saves on setting up a whole new structure, both in time and cost. So we can get somebody in there quickly. They can draw on the wider expertise across different sectors from within the Commission, but actually there's one person who ultimately carries that accountability, and that's, I think, the strength of this model. They can draw on the wider Commission, but they carry the responsibility. So we've got an independent and separate Commissioner who is responsible for the sector and its outcomes.
If suppliers have a stronger hand negotiating with supermarkets, isn't that likely to lead to higher prices rather than lower prices for consumers,
well,
particularly negotiating with large global brands?
Tom, thank you. I think there's plenty of room for benefit to be passed on to consumers. If we take that $1 million a day excess profits as a conservative estimate, which it was the Commission's most conservative estimate in their report, we think there's plenty of room there, $365 million a year, for that to be rebalanced between suppliers and the duopoly as appropriate. I'm keen to monitor what happens with suppliers' margins, and intend for the regulator to actually monitor how their margins are, both domestically in a continuity series, but also how they compare internationally. We think there's room for consumers to save and for what the proceeds are currently to be shared fairly.
Just on the wholesale issue, are you comfortable that foodstuffs in particular, which has said it's going to open up some of its wholesale arms to non-foodstuffs buyers, are you comfortable they're doing enough? And also in particular progressive counting, which doesn't seem to be moving at all towards opening up its wholesale arms.
Bernard, I think I won't discuss your characterisation, because I think there's evidence that both parties have publicly stated they are opening up and looking for ways to approach folk in the market. But look, the proof is in the pudding, and what I would say is that those two big players would be well advised to be dealing fairly. We've said that we are going to progress the quasi-regulatory regime that the Commerce Commission has put forward, which is a commercial response, effectively. But on top of that, I'm keen to progress a mandatory backstop. And we know that a mandatory backstop would require a whole lot more scrutiny over the very detail of their businesses in order to be successful. I don't think that's the ideal outcome. I think that it's in everybody's interest to find a commercial way through this. But up until now, that hasn't been achieved historically in a meaningful way. That wholesale access hasn't been supplied, despite in the past the duopoly flirting with it or having conversations with players in the market. So if we don't see that, then the mandatory backstop will kick in, and now's the chance for those in the duopoly to progress good commercial deals on their own terms, and I think everyone's well advised to get on with that. And I'm not here to make announcements about the wholesale regime today, but that would be my comment at this stage.
And what's the current timeframes for potential mandatory backstops?
I've said I want to have that in place by the end of this year.
You keep using... Go ahead, buddy.
Can you also talk about whether you're still on track to have potential options by October for a breakup of the duopoly?
I want to have cost-benefit analysis that gives me the ability to make decisions towards the end of this year.
And what sort of initial indications have you received from the Ministry about how possible or realistic it is?
Oh, look, I'm not going to go into that. We're at the early stages of analysis. It does need to be done thoroughly. I mean, the Commerce Commission itself noted with divestment that it was one of the more challenging things to pick apart. That is part of why they made the package of recommendations they did in the time frame they had. I think they put a really solid response together. I think it needs to go further, and that's why we're doing more work on it.
You keep using the phrase excess profit. In your eyes or your perspective, what is a reasonable level of profit?
Well, the current situation sees the duopoly making roughly twice what a reasonable return on capital would be. So effectively, half of what they're making now is what the Commerce Commission suggested would be a reasonable return on capital.
Do you think that's a safe avenue to be going down, the government deciding what is and isn't excessive profits for a private business?
I think that is a situation that we would only see in any determinative way if we get to the mandatory backstop. And that's why I'm encouraging the wholesale access regimes to open up voluntarily to strike commercial deals. I think that's in everybody's interest.
So it's success from your perspective and the government's perspective to see supermarket profits slashed from $1 million a day to, say, $500,000?
Success from my perspective is consumers getting a fair deal at the checkout.
Currently, I've just checked, cheese, a block of tasty cheese is $18.60. To that end, what do you think is fair price or a reasonable deal on a block of cheese?
Well, look, we know that a fair deal is going to depend upon brand, upon season, upon availability. And we know equally that supermarkets are competing at times on these things. We've seen some rollbacks of prices, blocks of cheese for a little over $10. I'm not going to get into the detail of each individual product and what it should be, but we know from the analysis of the Commerce Commission, and now it has the tools and the background analysis to work out what those kinds of profits are going forward through its new regulator. We know we want to see consumers getting a fairer deal over time.
And so can you guarantee that what you're announcing today will lower the cost of living?
Well, what we've seen through the market study already is the supermarkets have price freezes in place despite the global challenge of inflation. So we know that the spotlight coming on the sector actually has an effect all of itself. I want to see over time more competition, and we know the best way to achieve that is to have more players come into the market, both smaller players in New Zealand expanding and the opportunity hopefully for larger players to also consider New Zealand as an opportunity.
Would you consider sort of tax breaks or incentives to bring other players into the market to ease the path to come into New Zealand?
The Commerce Commission has been very clear that and it's quite a comprehensive package of things they've put forward, 14 recommendations that really get to the heart of the anti-competitive situation that we've observed historically, that say these things will make a material change. I've said I want to go a little bit further than that, because I actually think we need to be mandatory with the wholesale access. I think they're right to see the wholesale access piece as critical, but I want to go a bit further than that, and I want more regular scrutiny going forward, and that's why I've disagreed with that recommendation. But actually that whole package, where you get a competitive market, is what's actually going to benefit the consumer longer term, and that's what we're headed for.
Realistically, we are a sort of a very small population at the bottom of the world. So, I think it's one thing to sort of address the anti-competitive nature, right? But why not also incentivize sort of other players to come into the market and make it worth their while, rather than looking at it being like, it's a population of 5 million. why not sort of incentivise them to come into our market?
I've heard nobody call for that in the sector. I've heard nobody suggest tax breaks are going to bring people here, to bring offshore companies here to compete in the market. I've heard the warehouse say that it might be interested in exploring things if there was a more competitive environment. I've heard Night and Day say they might be worth considering growing in a more competitive environment. I've heard the existing supermarkets say they welcome competition now. So, I think we've got to create the characteristics of competition here that will make it attractive to new entrants to come, and for existing other players in the market to expand as well.
Is it reasonable to talk about forcing particularly foodstuffs to open up its wholesale operations to non-foodstuffs buyers when it's actually a cooperative which effectively delivers returns to its members by giving rebates at the wholesale level? So having to force foodstuffs wholesale to offer the same prices to everyone would actually require a complete change in financial structure for the company.
Well, what we are exploring with obviously we're not here to talk about the backstop regime particularly today, Bernard, but what we're exploring there are those different incentives that pull in different directions to make sure that we don't get perverse outcomes here. We want to make sure that a mandatory regime, if it has to kick in, will work. But in the first instance, a commercial solution is available now for the duopoly to strike deals with other players coming into the market.
Just
any other questions?
Elsewhere on
Yeah.
competition, do you think the new chair, whoever that might be, of the Commerce Commission, should have a more robust approach to corporate profits, and in particular the role it has played or not played in boosting inflation? Because when you look at the anti-monopoly watchdogs overseas, particularly in the United States, they have more of a progressive campaigning approach rather than a legalistic approach.
Well, I have to say I'm particularly excited about the Section 36 reforms that we've made. I think giving the Commerce Commission more powers and tools to do its business will see it have more teeth and an ability to get stuck in where it identifies issues and prosecute them. I also think that the market studies, which the Commerce Commission has had funded under the first term of the Labour-led government, have given it another set of powers that enable it to really dig in and understand what's going on in sectors. That is being closely observed by other sectors that jealously guard a reputation for being competitive, but people suspect might not be. And so we're seeing that have an effect on the market as well. I think these tools are a really good way into some of the challenges we've seen in the New Zealand market.
So would you expect a new chair to be more aggressive and effective?
I would see a new chair having a new set of tools to use, and I would expect them to use them.
Are we have to maybe speak to John?
Yeah, please. Yep.
Thank you. So John, what do you think of sort of what's been announced today? How effective will both the Code of Conduct be and I guess the powers that the Grocery Commissioner will have to investigate? Will consumers actually see the result of that?
I think they will over time. So it's an important station on a longer journey to fixing what is a bit of a train wreck of a market at the moment. So actually having strong regulation in place is a huge step forward. The models worked well in the telecommunications sector, which is often cited as quite analogous to what we see here. I realise there are different complexities between the two markets, but the Telco Commissioner has done a really good job in keeping telco sector in line in New Zealand. So I would hope that that's replicated through this model.
So was it?
But that required the government to step in and effectively break up a single very large monopoly network, whereas in this case you had two privately owned organisations, one of which is a disparately owned cooperative, and without the government having the same powers to break up the company.
Sure, there are different complexities in the supermarket sector than there were in the telecommunications sector when Telecom was split. I absolutely accept that. It's not necessarily completely off the cards, and there are different forms that could take, and I'm not here to necessarily advocate for that today. The comment was really directed at how effective the regulatory regime has been through the Commerce Commission and through the embodiment of regulation in a single commissioner has worked well.
Yeah, but so would you like to see the supermarkets you offer leave broken up though?
What I personally think is not necessarily the further work needs to be done, and I think, as the Minister's alluded to, officials are working through that at the moment, because there could be unintended consequences of that. There could actually be real benefits to it as well. And breaking up doesn't necessarily mean a telecom style split. There are multiple options that could be looked into rather than a kind of monolithic split, as we saw in the telecom case.
Do you think what was announced today will be the game changer, or what will be the game changer to stop New Zealanders having to pay, $19 for a kg of cheese?
Look, I don't think there's one single silver bullet. This is an incremental process that is being built out. This is an important step on the way. But we're not going to see immediate changes, I don't think, in prices at the stores. In fact, as the Minister's mentioned, the biggest single change is the voluntary rollbacks that all of this attention has forced the supermarkets to engage in. So they realise that they've lost their social licence. They can see from research that trust in the supermarkets is plummeting. They have needed to react, and they have. So as long as pressure is continually exerted on them, we would hope to see positive outcomes in the immediate term for consumers.
Just on consumer prices for electricity and for broadband, there's been a bunch of price increases rolled through in the last couple of months, which appear to have nothing to do with actual costs, but seem remarkably high, about double normal rates, and closer to the actual CPI inflation rate. How much...
it's a bit of a left-hand turn, Bernard, from where we're at. But
consumer prices,
sure.
Company approaches to margins. What do you think about the electricity industry and the broadband industry's approach to their prices?
I think the electricity industry prices that have come through, particularly from 1 April, there's a complex web of reasons behind that. So there's some regulatory change that's occurred, there's caps that have been lifted, there's various infrastructural reasons sitting in behind it. So it's very difficult to sit there and say companies are profiting needlessly. It would need to be studied more carefully, so I wouldn't be willing to say that. And I'm not fully across the broadband increases.
Yeah, I can briefly speak to it, but slightly off topic. But of course, this is why an anchor product is critical in the whole regime, and at the same time, costs do go up, and there is a regulatory mechanism for assessing those, and the lead player in the sector has to inform us of what those changes are, and there are flow-on effects. So I could come back to you with more detailed answers, but there's that anchor product in the market which I think is really critical to the regime.
So this is the chorus broadband.
Yep.
And they've just increased it by 5.5%.
Yeah, which at the moment is at the lower end of inflation over the next period in terms of expectations, isn't it?
Previous price, and their costs are fixed and sunk.
Yeah. Let's come back to you on more specific questions around that. Ultimately, I think having that anchor product in the market is a very valuable thing. And ultimately also, where there's a market and the Commerce Commission has some ability to, and the Commissioner, the Telecommunications Commissioner has the power to observe it, that's the situation we want to be in.
And just finally...
I'll take two more questions.
Just finally, on the broader issue of corporate profits as a reason for the rise in inflation, not just overseas, but here, how much of a factor do you think broadly corporate profits have been in driving inflation where it is here?
Well, I've listened to Bernard Hickey's podcasts, and they are quite instructive on the broader inflationary environment, the effects of the war in Ukraine, and so forth. I think it's a more complex question than that. However, where I'd say where we can observe that excess profits are being taken through the kind of detailed market analysis that's been done by the Commerce Commission in its market study, we have a very sound platform to act on. And, in an environment where Kiwis are feeling the pinch from the cost of living, here's a chance for the government to act on those findings as a part of, we've had the wider benefits package that was launched in the budget, but here's another opportunity to make sure that our supermarket sector is not extracting excess profits, that Kiwis are getting a fair deal at the supermarket checkout.
Can I just ask a question about the language in the code? My understanding is that the suppliers wanted the language to be around sort of fair dealing, or no, the suppliers wanted it to be around fair dealing while the supermarkets wanted sort of good faith. So which one did you land on?
Well, obviously we're up for consultation now. John was actually on the panel, so or spent some time on the panel, I think. So he's probably best to address the detail of that conversation.
I think that was a lively debate. You're right, and I think both are in the consultation documents. So it's out there for people to comment on which regime they think would be better.
What's your preference?
I think there's benefits for both. I probably have a bias towards good faith.
John, do you think the function's been sufficiently well resourced? I mean, how much resource do we need to make sure that all the practices that have occurred are sort of dealt with? Tens of thousands of suppliers and supplier relationships. What can one sort of commissioner do?
Well, I think the devil is in the detail there. The Commerce Commission will need to be adequately resourced to service this function, and finding the right people will be a challenge. It's a tight labour market for people with this expertise. I think it's a sensible move putting it in the Commerce Commission with its pre-existing expertise, but that expertise is allocated to market studies at the moment, so you might have to rob Peter to pay Paul for a little bit. But as long as it's well resourced and you can find the people, it feels like a good move to me.
Tom and I will put our CVs in.
They'll be welcome. Okay, thanks everybody. Really appreciate it. Cheers.
Probably had it, wouldn't it?
Consumer New Zealand for hosting us here today. And secondly, thanks to media as well for coming for this announcement. Today, and without further ado, I can announce that we're appointing a permanent grocery commissioner, and they will be hosted at the Commerce Commission, and they will maintain a watchful eye over the supermarkets. The permanent commissioner will be a referee for the sector, keeping the duopoly honest and proactively blowing the whistle where a problem is suspected. The Grocery Commissioner will also ensure government's reforms for the sector are implemented and that Kiwis are getting a fair deal at the checkout. The Grocery Commissioner will be solely focused on supermarkets, supported in their efforts with a base at the Commerce Commission. It makes sense to do it this way. The Commission has a wealth of knowledge when it comes to economic and competition regulation. They've got sleeves rolled up experience with economic and competition regulation, fair trading, consumer protection, and of course with the grocery sector itself. And we want our watchdog to be able to tap into that resource whenever it is required. The Grocery Industry Competition Bill is expected to be introduced later this year, and a commissioner will be appointed following the bill's passing. We need to ensure we get the right person in the role so that the search will, of course, be thorough. This appointment ultimately is too important not to get right on behalf of consumers. Further to that, today I can announce that consultation opens on a mandatory code of conduct for the sector. That'll be a code of conduct between major grocery retailers and their suppliers. Historically, there has been an imbalance in the bargaining power major grocery retailers have over their suppliers. The Grocery Code of Conduct will address this by preventing the major retailers from using their power to push costs and risks onto those suppliers. It will ensure that this relationship is conducted fairly. That's especially important for the small artisan brands that are emerging, startups that want to get their products on shelves. We want them to feel empowered, and we also want consumers to enjoy the extra range, the added variety that smaller producers bring to our supermarkets. The draft code of conduct has been developed with input from an advisory group that includes representatives from the major grocery retailers and from groups that represent suppliers and also consumers. This draft code is available on MBIE's website and will be open for feedback for 5 weeks. The other actions and reforms as part of the government's response to the grocery retail market study are also moving at pace. Last week, our bill to ban restrictive covenants passed into law. That means we have officially put an end to the anti-competitive land wars, which have been silently hampering competition in the grocery sector for years. It will stop the major supermarkets from dictating the terms of leases to block opposition retailers from getting a foothold in an area, and should come as great news to would-be competitors who will now be able to access suitable land for their new stores without having to worry that they're going to have to fight legal battles ahead. Momentum is with us now, and government will continue to keep supermarkets in the spotlight to ensure that Kiwis get a fairer deal at the checkout. I invite John from Consumer New Zealand to come forward as well. He may be, I suspect, happy to take questions from a consumer perspective. Obviously, Consumer New Zealand has been a part of putting the Code of Conduct together. So John and I are now very happy to take questions.
Minister, what powers will the Grocery Commissioner have?
So the Grocery Commissioner will have the ability to issue warnings. They'll have the ability to put fines in place as well for when Code of Conduct breaches have been established. That may well be yet a percentage of turnover, which would certainly keep larger players focused, I think. And they'll be able to go to the courts as well and seek that contracts be overruled. There are a range of other kind of trade remedies that are available to them, but they'll have quite substantial powers.
And so how will you guarantee